together again. If you just walked in, you're new here. My name is Lou. I'm one of the pastors here. Today, we are wrapping up a series called Broken Heroes. We like to take our messages, we group them together, we call that a series. And today, we're at the end of a series. And basically, what we've been talking about is the brokenness of these people that we have learned, some of us, to look up to, and what we can learn from their flaws, from their brokenness, and sometimes the hope that we can find in their brokenness. So today is the last broken hero, but before we jump into it, I'll tell you a story, all right? So when I was in high school, I wasn't really too into the whole academic side of school. I just kind of did the bare minimum to get by. When I was in college, that kind of got my head on straight. But in high school, I was just trying to get by. And so when it came time to apply for schools, I was really banking on the extracurricular activities, It's like trying to get into the right clubs, trying to join the right things that maybe they'll let me into the school. And so fortunately for me, my school had these leadership positions for seniors. They were called prefects. And there was this one prefect position that I felt like I had the chance to get, right? The person who was in charge of making the decision was my football coach. And so I felt like I kind of had an in with him. And the person who was currently serving as the prefect of that department was a friend of mine. So she was part of the interview. I was like, okay, this is going to be a breeze. I got it in the bag. Some of you know this story. I've told it before. Like, it's all good. I feel like here's my in, and I'm going to be fine. So I fill out the application, and I'm granted an interview. And I go into the interview, I sit down, and they start dishing out the interview questions. And it's everything you would expect, right? They're asking me about what my experience has been like, strengths. And then they get to the weaknesses question. They're like, what's your greatest weakness, do you feel like, as a person, as a leader, that might affect this position? And I like to be pretty upfront. Pretty transparent, pretty honest. And I really went for that, like wholeheartedly. So I told him, I was like, well, with a smile on my face, I'm like, well, honestly, sometimes I've got something to do and I procrastinate. And I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off, and I'm watching them. They're like, uh-huh. They're like leaning in, like, yeah. I'm like, I put it off, and honestly, sometimes I don't even do it. And in that moment, I felt the opportunity just shatter. It's like it left the room. In an instant, it was gone. I could tell from the look on their face, I had blown it, right? Over. Situation was broken, and I couldn't fix it. I couldn't go back. I remember going home and trying to explain this to my parents, so it all went well. I was like, I'm not sure, we shouldn't get too hopeful about this whole thing. And I was later told that I didn't get it because of the way I answered that question. But here's my question for you, all right? Have you ever been there before? Maybe not applying for a position, but in life where you feel like something could be. Maybe it's an opportunity, maybe it's something you're hoping for, but it's a vision of a desirable future, this idea of fulfilled potential, like one day I'm gonna be that, or one day I'll receive that, or achieve that. And there's this idea that it's coming, and it's on the way, and there's joy, and there's hope, and there's expectation, but then something happens, and it's like over, shattered. The opportunity is gone. What you thought could be is not going to be. And maybe it's your fault, maybe it's not. And maybe it's something more serious than just applying for a position. Maybe it's a relationship that you thought was going to be something. You were hopeful, you were expecting, but then in an instant, it was broken. We could say it was broken beyond repair. There's no going back. There's no fixing it. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Maybe it wasn't a relationship. Maybe it was a big career change. Maybe it was a friendship. Maybe it was a plan. Maybe it was the hope of being in a relationship. Maybe it was the hope of having children. But there's this idea that I thought something was going to be, and whether it's my fault or not, that is gone, it's over, that dream is shattered, it's broken, and it can't be undone. If you've ever been there, you're not alone. You're not alone. And it is so important that we understand where to go when we find ourselves in that place, because having a dream, a hope shattered in front of you, feeling like something is broken beyond repair, it can send us to dark places where maybe you'll find yourself making decisions you didn't think you'd make, going down roads you never thought you'd travel, becoming someone you never thought you'd become, because what you thought was going to be is no more and it can't be fixed. And so one of the people that we're looking at today to wrap up the series is somebody who finds himself in this position. If you're familiar with a lot of the Bible stories we talk about here, his name is Peter. Peter, he was a close friend of Jesus. In fact, when we meet him, his name was Simon, but Jesus changed it. Which I always think is interesting, right? Like, you gotta have a certain level of confidence for someone to be like, my name's Simon. Just be like, no, I'm not calling you that. He calls him Peter, which means rock, which would say so much about Peter's personality. Jesus meets Peter or Simon at the time, and he's a fisherman. And what that meant in that culture was that at some point he didn't cut the mustard. Like, in that culture, as a child, you would go to school in ancient Israel, and you'd study as hard as you could, and if you made it past a certain point, you'd be promoted, not just like a grade, but only certain people went up to the next level, where you would take your education a little bit further, and it would become a little bit more intense, and a little more intense, and if you made it past that level, you'd go to the next level. And all along the way, people are dropping until eventually, if you get to the top, you're given this opportunity to be what they called a disciple, a student of a specific rabbi, someone who would have been well known in the community, and your goal was to be like them, to follow them, to do what they did. And so Peter was a fisherman, which meant at some point, we don't know exactly where, but he didn't make it. Like a lot of people, most people didn't make it to the top. And so he went into the family business. It seems like in every story we read about Peter, he's never catching any fish, so it doesn't seem like he's that great of a fisherman, but we know at some point he didn't make it through school, and now he's doing this, and that's when he meets Jesus. And then there are ups and downs. Like, Peter's journey is it's a story of highlights and lowlights, of big victories and big failures. Everything he does is big and loud. His personality is robust. He's just in your face. He would do very well on Long Island. He's just who he is, right? And so there are these moments where we see a glimpse of his potential. There's this one time they're hanging out together. Jesus is with his followers, and they're talking about who he is. And so Jesus is asking, he's like, who do people say I am? He's kind of explained it to them, but they never really get it. He's like, who do they say I am? And the answers are getting thrown around, and then he gets to the disciples, to Peter. He's like, who do you say I am? And Peter blurts out the answer. He's like, I know this one. He's like, you are the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. You're not just a regular guy. You're not just a rabbi. You're the one we've been waiting for. And Jesus, we don't know how he was feeling in the moment, but what he says to Peter, I imagine with a smile on his face, like, you're right. And what you've just learned, what just clicked for you was something that God communicated to you himself. Like, that was a divine revelation. And it's like this, wow. And Jesus says, you're Peter. And maybe you know this. He says, on this rock I'll I'll build my church or my following, and nothing will stop it. That's why we're here today, because of that promise. Peter was there, and there we get like a glimpse of his potential. It's like at that point he's like clay, right? And we're watching him, and he's being molded and formed and shaped. He was a fisherman. He wasn't thinking his future was going to be all that great, but now he's a disciple of Jesus. Like he was just given a shot straight to the top. And we're watching him, and he's having these big victories. And then like a few minutes later, he'd have these huge failures. Like right after that, Jesus and Peter have this discussion, and it ends with Jesus getting frustrated. And he's like, you're not thinking about the things of God. You're thinking about your own plans. And there's this rebuke, and we see like a little dent in the sculpture. Nothing that can't be fixed, but little bumps along the way. There's one moment where Jesus is walking on water. If you ever heard that story, it's pretty crazy. He's walking on water, and Peter, being the guy that he is in the boat. He's scared, but he goes, all right, if you're Jesus, let me come out onto the water. And Jesus says, come. And he does. He steps out, and he experiences something miraculous. He like actually starts to stand on the water. Again, I've never done this. I don't know what it's like, but it sounds pretty nuts. And then he doubts. We're told his faith starts to shake, and he starts to sink. And there it's like, whoa, wow, big victory, big failure. Big, but nothing that can't be fixed. And we're watching him, and he's being molded. And eventually, he like starts to take shape. He starts to stand out among the people that he's with as a leader, someone who's going to do something pretty amazing. And then on the last night, one of the last nights, what we call the Last Supper, Jesus is with his followers, and he sits them down. They have to have a sit-down conversation. And a lot of crazy stuff happens at this meal, but there's an exchange between Jesus and Peter. Jesus explains that things are about to get really hard, that he's going to die, that one of them is going to turn on him, he's going to lose his life, and he says he'll be back, but things don't quite make sense to them in that moment. And so Jesus says he's going to go away. And Peter asks a question. Here he's referred to as Simon. It says Simon Peter asked him, Lord, all right, you say you're going to leave us, but where are you going? Right? He says probably what everyone's thinking. And Jesus says, where I'm going, you can't follow now. You can't. But you'll follow later. So Peter questions that. And he asks, why can't I follow you now? Like, not for anything, but you're going to tell me what I can and can't do? He says, I'll not only will I follow you, I will lay down my life for you. And in that moment, he's like on the mountaintop. He's higher than he's ever been. He's ready to give it all away because he's so blown away by who Jesus is. And maybe you've been there where you have these moments and you're like, whoa, this is life-changing. And there he is. And he makes this, then Jesus calls him out and basically says, will you really lay down your life for me, Peter? He says, very truly I tell you, you remember this, very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you'll disown me 3 times. You won't just like not go where I'm going, you're going to disown me. Like say you're not with me, totally forsake me. And again, we don't know what Peter's response was to that, but he makes this prediction. And just a few hours later, Jesus is arrested. He's taken away by these guards, and all of a sudden, things start looking pretty dark. In the same night, this is just hours later, and Peter is approached by someone who recognizes him and asks a question, looks at Jesus tied up, taken away, looks at Peter and says, hey, wait a second, aren't you with that guy? Weren't you someone that was following him? Peter says, no. Once. And then the night continues on. He's watching. Things are getting worse and worse. He's seeing Jesus. He's being beaten. This guy that was all powerful now looks pretty helpless. And someone else comes up to him, asks him the same question. Aren't you with that guy? Aren't you in his group? Peter says, no. I don't know who that guy is. I'm not one of his. And a little while later, someone else comes up to him. And with even greater emphasis, we're told that he curses. Someone says, you're with that guy. And he says, no. 3 times. 3 times. And in an instant, within moments, Peter, who was supposed to be this leader, who's being shaped and formed and sculpted, who, yeah, he had his dings, he had his mistakes, but nothing couldn't be fixed, like within an instant. It's all shattered. And it's broken beyond repair. We're told he weeps bitterly. Like, he doesn't know exactly how the thing's going to turn out, but he knows that he blew it, and he remembers what Jesus said. And maybe you've been there, where you've had a moment where it looked like everything was great, and then it shatters. And you know how you got there from just a little earlier when things were so great? You know how this broke so fast? But you know things will never be the same, because it's broken beyond repair. And so the question is, where do we go from there? What do we do with that? Because now we're left with these broken pieces. And this is what it feels like. Like, I don't even know where to begin with this relationship. I don't even know what the next step looks like. Is this salvageable? Is my future still something I thought that it could be? Or is it over because of this mistake, because of what happened to me here, because that went that way? Well, if you know the story, Jesus rises from the dead. Right? That's what we're celebrating next week. And it's epic. They were supposed to expect it coming, but they didn't. And so Peter runs down to the tomb. You probably know the story. They go down, they see there's no body there. It's amazing. He comes back from the dead, and they have this encounter with him. They see him in person. They're like, oh my goodness, holy cow. And it is such great news for everybody there. But you know, in the background, in the back of Peter's mind, there's this lingering, these 3 no's, lingering in the background. Like, are we going to talk about this? Like, yes, you rose from the dead. You got your thing together. It's looking great for you, but what does this mean for me? Yeah, there's good news about Jesus. Great, right? Maybe you felt that way. Yeah, I'm so glad you're excited about who God is, but I'm in a mess right here. And that's where Peter is. And then there's this scene just a few days later where they're on the beach. They're eating breakfast together. And Jesus pulls Peter aside, and he asks him a question. He doesn't mention what happened, but he asks him a question. He says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter replies, yes. And then Jesus asks him the same question again. He says, do you love me? And Peter replies, yes. And then he asks him a third time. And this time, Peter has an emotional response because he sees exactly what Jesus is doing. And he replies, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And what Jesus is doing in that moment is showing Peter what Tom talked about last week, this idea of redemption. Peter quit on Jesus when things went bad. But Jesus does not quit on him. And he knows his story is not over. It can't be repaired. It's broken. But it can be redeemed. It can be used for good. You see, if we're just going to repair something, it's going to be the way it was before. And unfortunately, that's not part of the story. And that may not be the part of your story. We can't just pretend that it's not going to happen. But there could be good that comes from this. After this point, Peter knows better than anyone else what it means to have your highs and have your lows. He knows what it looks like to be so confident in one moment and so broken in another moment. And he knows how willing Jesus is not only to forgive, but to use that brokenness for good. And so we can say what is too broken to be repaired is not too broken to be redeemed. Here's what I mean by this, and maybe you remember this from a little while ago. There's this ancient Japanese practice. It's called kintsugi. It's the art of really redeeming what's been broken. This at one point was a cracked bowl. But they took these pieces and they laced them with gold, and it's that gold that holds them together. And now this piece of pottery is actually worth more than it was before it was broken. Can it be repaired? No. You know what happened to this bowl. But there's something beautiful in the brokenness. And we know there's something beautiful that came from Peter's story. There's this one instance where Peter's sticking up for somebody named John Mark who's struggling. He's doubting. Peter stands by him. At the very least, we know that Peter's story was written down, and we've been talking about it for 2,000 years. So does the mistake go away? No. But there is beauty that can come from this brokenness. And I don't know what your situation looks like, but what I can tell you is that it's not just gone. Like, you can't go back and change the story. But you can start where you are, and you can change the way it ends. This is the hope of redemption. It cannot be repaired, but it's not too broken to be redeemed. Or as we've said before, if you've been here, Peter, he's broken, but he's better for it. There is something about Peter's story that would not be nearly as beautiful if he never broke. And this is the story of redemption. I honestly don't know how you get from here to here. But redemption is the promise that you can. Because what is too broken to be repaired is not too broken to be redeemed. And so that's Peter's story. That's how Peter breaks. But Peter is not the broken hero of this story. The broken hero of this story, and really the broken hero behind all of these stories, is not Peter, it's Jesus. See, like all these other stories, all these other heroes, we can learn from them, we can be inspired by them, we can be given hope from them, but they themselves cannot do anything about our brokenness. Renee, can you help me out with the table? You see, at that dinner, the same dinner when Jesus predicted the way that Peter would break, he explained something else. Thank you. He took bread, at this Passover meal, this meal that they had been celebrating forever as an ancient Jewish person, this thing that used to represent them coming out of Egypt, and they would have bread and different things at that dinner to symbolize different parts of that whole experience. But Jesus redefined something in that moment. He took the bread on Passover, and you know what he did? He said, this bread is my body. It's me. And he broke it. And what he explained was that through that brokenness, we would be healed. And maybe you've heard the script where Jesus said, this is my body and it's broken for you. And he took a cup and he said, this is my blood that's been shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. But what he's saying here is that in your brokenness, there is hope for redemption. It is through his brokenness that ours is redeemed. It's his way of saying, this is how far I'll go for you. And so what he also said there was that when you come together, take this in remembrance of me. He gave us these things we call ordinances. We celebrated one of them last week with baptism. We celebrate a decision someone has made. And we also celebrate communion, where we remember how he broke for us, but he did it willingly. He broke for our brokenness. And he gave everything for us, not so that he would just put a good spin on some of our issues, but to show us this is how far I'll go for you, to know that you may have quit on me, but I will not quit on you. Whatever your broken pieces look like today, your story is not over. There is beauty that can come from that brokenness. And so we got some team members that are going to pass out some little communion cups. They're these little compact ways of taking communion. They're going to give you a bucket. You can take one and pass it along. If this is not something that you're comfortable doing, or if you don't believe this and you don't want to participate, there is no pressure to be part of any of this. But if this is something that you believe and something that you want to participate in, like followers of Jesus have been participating in for literally 2,000 years, you can take one today, and I'll ask you to hold on to it, and we'll do it together. If you're the last one on the row, you can just put the bucket down. We'll come around and collect it for you. And when we're done, you can put your cup right under your chair. We'll grab them after the service. So on that night, Jesus sat with his followers, his closest friends. He sat with a bunch of broken people, like you and me. People with highs and lows, people with great victories and great disappointments. People that he knew were going to blow it again. This was before Peter's brokenness. And he said, this is my body, which is given for you. This bread that he broke. He said, as often as you come together, when you gather together as a community of broken people, do this to remember me. So let's do it together. And in the same way, he took a cup that at one point for the ancient Jewish people represented one thing, but one he was redefining. And he said, this is my blood, which was a reference to the ancient Jewish sacrificial system. He's explaining, I'm going to give everything for you. I'm going to bleed. So your sins could be forgiven. Paul would explain later that in his blood, we have redemption. And so he said to do this in remembrance of him. To remember that what may be too broken to repair is not too broken to be redeemed. Your story isn't over.